But I did have a serial killer at a sex offender hospital in another state who was found with 30 vaginas in his freezer.
Maybe he just like roast beef.
When you hear 30 vaginas in the freezer, what are you picturing?
I just feel like this podcast is really losing it right now.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, it's fine.
You guys wanted stories. There you go.
I just want to have roast beef sandwiches all of a sudden.
Really? Do you?
No. Dr. Haji. Dr. Lina Haji,
yes.
Clinical psychologist. So that's the way I see you every day. You know what? Actually, I want to do something different today.
Yeah.
Can you tell people where to find you? And I want to start off with that. That way, we've been doing it at the end of the podcast. It doesn't make sense. People
Fair
probably
enough.
don't listen to 3 hours of this. So where can people find you first and foremost?
Okay, so the name of my practice is Rise Psychological Services. My website is www.risepsychological.com. My Instagram is, what's my Instagram? Rise_psychological_services. And I also just started a YouTube channel under the same name, Rise Psychological Services. So check all those out. That's how you can find
Awesome. And so tell me a little bit about your private practice.
So
actually, let me start off with
go
this.
ahead.
You're a clinical psychologist. How did you fall into this career?
So I didn't fall into it. I knew I wanted to be a psychologist at age 9. And I know that it's super lucky because not everybody gets to discover their passion at age 9. At age 9, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. There was some turmoil between my parents, and I had stopped eating, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. My parents took me to neurologists, cardiologists, you name it, pediatricians, and people thought I was trying to lose weight because I was a gymnast, and was it anorexia, but I felt like I really couldn't swallow. Mm-hmm. Long story short, it was basically conversion disorder. I was so stressed and anxious that I thought I couldn't swallow. And I remember my mother took me to what I thought was just another medical office, and this woman started asking me questions that no other doctor had asked me. Do you feel like you don't want to be here sometimes, And I was 9, so I didn't know what depression or death or suicide was, but this woman was asking me stuff that I had never been asked before, and I felt heard and understood. And it sounds like such a corny story, but I left that office and I asked my mother, what was that woman? And my mother said, a psychologist. And I was like, done deal. That's what I'm doing at 9. And then in college, I took a kind of a dumbed down forensic psychology class called Psychology and the Law. And this like gorgeous woman walks in, and she has this presence, and she has like a power suit on, and she starts talking about how she's worked with like psychopaths and serial killers and sex offenders. And I'm like, oh my God, because at that time you thought it was just old white men who worked in forensic psychology. So she kind of switched the narrative for me, and then I shifted into forensics. So that's
straight into forensics, so hardcore.
Yeah, I got my first job in a prison when I was 23. I had no idea what I was doing. All I had was a bachelor's degree.
What were you doing at that point?
I was like a bachelor's level counselor, working with inmates in like what they call a 3/4 way house. So they're on their way back into society.
It's like a reintegration.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. In New Jersey. So that was my first experience with corrections. And I've been on and off with corrections for 20 years.
Okay. So I'm sure a lot of listeners don't know, what exactly is a forensic psychologist?
So a forensic psychologist is somebody who applies clinical knowledge to a legal question. So my foundation is clinical, and I think that's absolutely pertinent. Like, I'm a clinical psychologist first and foremost. Technically, you can't call yourself a forensic psychologist until you're board certified. I'm in that process now, which is why I still refer to myself as a clinical psychologist. Mm-hmm. So it's basically, I do a lot of competency evaluations. Is this defendant competent to stand trial? Are they not guilty by reason of insanity? What are the odds that this sex offender will reoffend?
These are all the questions that I have for you today.
Okay, I'm getting carried away.
No,
but
good.
So basically, yes, you're taking clinical knowledge and you're applying it to answer a legal question. That's what a forensic psychologist does.
Okay. And so I guess I'm going to fast forward to, I'm going to speak, I guess, towards the students that are probably listening. In order to become a forensic psychologist, I guess, what's some advice that you have for anybody who wants to enter the field?
If you're interested in forensics, I would say, first and foremost, like I said, clinical knowledge is the key. So to have a clinical foundation, understand diagnosis, treatment, personality disorders, symptoms, basically a really good foundation of clinical psychology is your best bet. And then my second recommendation is to work in corrections. Corrections is very hard, very stressful, but you really get a full clinical experience for that population. And so I think any work in corrections, even if you're not doing mental health work, just being in that environment, understanding the system, seeing the different kind of inmates and all that kind of stuff, those are my two biggest recommendations: a foundation in clinical psychology and work in corrections, and then go on to forensic psychology.
All right, Sam. Actually, my daughter, she loves SVU. I don't know why.
Me too.
She's hooked on it. And I'm like, all I hear is rape in the background. And I'm like, Eva, what are you watching? You're 13 years old. Please find something else to watch. But so what do you tell to somebody that age who might have this picture of what forensic psychology is like based on what the media presents to them? So what are some misconceptions they may have, and what's some advice you might give to that person to say, this isn't really the way it is?
So that's a really good question, and I can totally relate to your daughter. I love her because I love SVU. And I remember I would come home from work in prisons when I was like early 20s, and then I would turn on Lockup or Forensic Files or True Crime or Investigation, and my mother would be like, "Don't you have enough of this at work?" And I was like, "No, like I'll watch Ted Bundy till 1 o'clock in the morning." And I'm still that way, all I watch is true crime. I'm obsessed. So I would say the biggest misconception, first of all, people confuse forensic psychology with forensic science. Forensic science, is ballistics and blood and analyzing bodies and crime scenes, and that's very different. Forensic psychology is really psychology applied to criminality, really. So you're going into the mind of the criminal, and so that's the first misconception I hear about. The other thing is a lot of things on TV are very Hollywoodified, understandably so. It's for our entertainment, but things are much more gray than they are on television. On TV, it's usually very black and white. He's a very obviously bad man, or he was a perfect member of society, and then all of a sudden he murdered someone. Like, that's not usually how it works. It's usually a lot more gray than that. There are so many contributing factors, as you know. There's history of trauma, there's parenting, there's socioeconomic status, there's education, there's medical issues, neurological issues. I mean, sociological issues. I can go on and on into what is the makeup of somebody. And I don't think TV always accurately gets that. It's usually more black and white, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think, when you watch it on media, it's some random crime that happens when the truth is this began in childhood, right?
Right.
So that's what I was gonna, segue into. What's a common theme that you find in a lot of the criminals that you sit across? And I don't even, the people you sit across who happen to be in prison, right?
Right.
What are common themes in their childhood and their upbringing and patterns of behavior that you, have recognized anecdotally through your experience?
So I would say the biggest common theme I see is lack of education and lack of, and maybe, this sounds very judgmental, but poor parenting. And you see a lot of, I'm going to call them inmates, I'm stereotyping, but you see a lot of inmates who came from these low socioeconomic backgrounds. Maybe their father was in prison, their mother was addicted to drugs, there was no real supervision. The school didn't care if they showed up because it's a low socioeconomic school. And so it's kind of like they're doomed to fail from the beginning, And so I see a lot of this inability to have childhood interventions. And I'm not saying inmates aren't responsible for their actions, right? As adults, we all have choices, and it's not like you had a poor childhood, so now you're doing life in prison. I don't buy that. But we can't deny that some people just have it a lot rougher. And if you don't have any education, or if you don't know how to feed yourself, you don't have any food because your mother is addicted to drugs and your father's absent, and you start selling weed at age 16 to feed yourself and your siblings. Again, I'm not saying that's okay, but what are you supposed to do? You're a kid, And so I see that a lot, where people have grown up with hardships or histories of trauma or poor education and no resources, and they end up engaging in illegal activities.
Do you feel that as a society, just imprisoning these individuals, are we doing any justice for them? So I guess my question is, there's a lot of countries where prison or jails are actually a center for rehab.
Right.
here in the United States, the common theme is it's almost a kennel where we're just sticking people in cages, allowing them to fend for themselves, forming gangs and unions within those prisons, getting longer sentences because of illegal activities that go on within the prison system. Like, what are we doing?
What are we doing? I totally agree. And so, do I think people need to be held accountable for their actions? Absolutely. You know, I'm not saying that we should be kind of kumbaya, he made a mistake and let's just get him, you know, a degree and he'll be fine. I don't think that's the answer either. But I think both extremes are kind of messed up. The prison system, and I've worked in 9 different prisons in 4 states, and there's a lot of variability between states. I can honestly say Florida is one of the worst.
Okay.
I wrote my dissertation on that. So I'm a little bit of a hypocrite. But as you mentioned, prison in the United States is strictly punitive. You know, it's not rehabilitative. They've done away with GED programs. They've done away with trades. They've done away with college degrees. There was, I remember I worked at Sing Sing maximum security prison in New York when I had my master's degree in 2007, a couple of years. And they had a master's program there for, like, of course, it was incentive based, right? You had to be a good inmate. You had not any behavioral problems, not any substance abuse to get into the master's program. And only 13 guys did that master's program. But from what I understand, and that was 15 years ago, not one of them has recidivated. Not one has gone back to prison. And so that just tells you the power of actual rehabilitation and education. Because some of these guys, they get out of prison, they're worse than when they went in. They came in, they might have done a dumb crime, a robbery, drug sale, something nonviolent, and then they got addicted to drugs in prison because there's tons of contraband in prison. They joined a gang. They learned to fight. They learned to make weapons. They learned to lie better. They learned to manipulate better. They get out of prison, and now you have an even worse, worse criminal, better criminal, so to speak. So, yeah, the rehabilitation component is completely lacking. It's a mess.
And why do you think that is? Where are the funds going? Because prisons, as we know, are money makers.
Right.
They're major money makers. So what are we doing with that? And who's making the money?
So there are a few people that are just pocketing money. And I actually wrote my dissertation on Florida privatized prisons versus state-run prisons in New York and the impact of recidivism on dually diagnosed inmates. Sounds a little long and boring. But so privatized prisons.
Before you go, can you just define what recidivism rates are?
Yes, sorry. So recidivism is the act of recommitting crimes. So to recidivate means you committed a crime, you did your time, you got out, you recidivated, which means you committed another crime. And so what my research, again, this is just a doctoral dissertation, showed that privatized prisons, because there's a money-making incentive. And I tell, my inmates every time they recidivate, like every time you commit a crime, they're making money off of you. Literally, they're making money off of you. They want you to recommit crimes because every time you enter prison, they get money from the government and they only have to fulfill certain guidelines and then the rest goes in their pocket. So number one, privatized prisons really are the devil. They will... I'll give you an example. I worked in a Florida prison, in a California prison, and all prisons have their flaws, and California has their flaws. In a California prison that I was working at, there were 24 psychologists, 24 social workers, 24 forensic psychiatrists, and 24 art and music therapists. In Florida, there are 1 to 2.
For how many inmates?
For 1,200 to 1,500 inmates.
Perfect. That's a great ratio.
A caseload of 1,500 inmates, and make sure they don't, recidivate,
just
or
so
that they
people
don't
know,
suicide.
The typical caseload for any psychologist or therapist is maybe 32, 35 is
and that's
heavy.
High.
Yeah, 35 is heavy.
Yeah.
So that's insane.
It's insane.
It's impossible is what it is.
It's impossible, and it's not treatment. It's making sure we don't get sued. That's what it is. So I was a clinical director at a prison where I had 15 therapists working under me, and their caseloads were 150, 200. That's not therapy. They're doing drive-bys. They're going by the cell. Are you suicidal, homicidal? No. Okay, next.
Right,
Are you suicidal, homicidal? No. Okay, next. That's it. That's all they can do. It's not the therapist's fault. It's the lack of funding, the lack of resources. So I think the money, back to your original question, the money is really going to a few profiting people at the top who really don't care about the real cause.
You know who those people are?
I've met a couple of them.
We won't say any names? No. All right, that's fine. Seems like they're powerful people.
They are.
We'll let you be for now.
For now.
So the prison system, yeah, this is something I've always thought about, honestly, just because. How about, what are your thoughts on solitary confinement? Because this is something that's often used in prisons, and we know that people who end up in solitary confinement end up harming themselves, can even go into psychosis, just even with somebody who has no previous mental health diagnosis in terms of a psychotic disorder, can have auditory and visual hallucinations due to the lack of stimuli that exists. So what are your thoughts on the use of solitary confinement?
You know, I agree. And it literally, you know, neurologically changes the brain, as you know, and I've seen people who have no mental health history have psychotic breaks in solitary confinement. However, the flip side is you do have some psychopathic, horribly behaved inmates. I mean, I'm talking about the inmates who are still committing crimes in prison, stabbing people, raping people, spitting on officers, throwing feces. I mean, you know, I don't want to get too graphic, but this is the reality of, okay, so let's go. So throwing feces, you know, F you, when I get out, I'm going to find your wife, I'm going to kill her. Like the really psychopathic, problematic inmates who are not only, you know, making life a living hell for other inmates and staff, but what are we supposed to do with them? So of course, the clinical side of me is saying solitary confinement is not okay. It makes people worse. It makes them literally mentally ill. It's inhumane. But then what? I mean, some of these guys really, and females, have to be separated. So it's a really good question, and something that we as psychologists have to do better and come up with an alternative answer. But again, if you have a guy who's stabbing people, raping people, spitting at people left and right, and he's just a 24/7 menace, what are you going to do? You know, they did away with long-term solitary confinement at Rikers Island. My friend is a clinical director there, and it's mayhem. The inmates are running the prison. They're fighting all the time. They're getting high. They're assaulting a lot of correction officers, assaulting a lot of staff. So both answers thus far don't work. I don't really have an answer. We have to find something else.
So it's just the system as a whole seems fragmented completely, right?
It's completely fragmented, and it's either super punitive or way too quote unquote liberal, and you know, neither of those extremes work. What we have to focus on is empirically validated treatment that actually works, you know, behavior modification. And if a guy needs to be isolated, fine, but he doesn't have to be in a black box for 3 years with no kind of stimuli, you know, maybe a separate place with some kind of activities, some kind of book to read, something, you know. We have to really think outside the box, pun intended, that when it comes to these problematic behavior or high psychopathy inmates. But yeah, there are times where, you know, I've seen an inmate where I'm like, he can't be in general population. He's so bad. He's so dangerous. We have to put him somewhere else.
Yeah. Do you think deinstitutionalization was good for society?
No.
So there was a point in time in what it was it
70s?
The 70s? Yeah. In the 70s where we transitioned away from what these institutions were severely mentally ill people were basically placed due to the advent of antipsychotics. Mm-hmm. And so now people were reintegrating into society, many of which have done well or did well. But then there were still those outliers where you see them on the street, still vividly psychotic. Mm-hmm. And there's not I worked with the homeless population at Camilla's house for a while. Cool. Yeah, so I found that there were people that we didn't know where to put them. They can't go to a nursing home. They can't go to an ALF. So where do they end up? In the prison system. And so we have these people who are not criminals. They're just severely mentally ill. And that's where we put them. And so, again, what do we...
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's deinstitutionalization, and I touched on that in my dissertation as well, was a huge mistake, because we need psych hospitals. We need state-run facilities. Like you said, some of these guys and females, they're mentally ill, but they're not bad, or they're not committing crimes unless out of necessity, you know. And again, I'm not excusing anyone's behavior, but how are you supposed to eat? How are you supposed to sleep? How are you supposed to survive unless you're, I don't know, taking a loaf of bread, whatever it is. And so Cook County Jail in Chicago and what's the huge jail in LA, those have become the largest mental health institutions delivering mental health care. And it's really, really sad, because I know so many inmates that didn't get any treatment until they got arrested. So they never saw a psychiatrist and needed it. You know, I'm talking about schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, bipolar. they needed meds, they needed therapy, they needed some sort of intervention. They never got it until they hit the prison system. So in a weird way, it's kind of like, okay, well, prison is doing something right because or else at least we're giving them treatment. But it's a sham.
Yeah.
It's bare minimum treatment. And then when they get out of prison, like you said, Camilla's house, that's the next step, right? You get out of prison, you have no job, no GED, no family support, no skills. Maybe you struggle with an addiction. Maybe you're hearing voices. And they just go, okay, go to Camilla's house because that's the place. And then you guys are stuck with like, well, what now?
Yeah.
What now?
You end up in a shelter bed for 30, 60, or 90 days.
Right.
Then guess what? It's okay. You're discharged back to the street. And then the cycle repeats itself.
And then you commit a probation violation and you're back in prison.
And you're back in prison. Possession of marijuana, loitering, trespassing.
Yeah.
And so now you're back in prison for another year, 2 years.
Correct. And round we go.
Yeah. Then you get into a fight in prison. That tacks on another year.
Right.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. How do you determine if people will be repeat offenders? Can you determine that? I was thinking about, or even can we predict, right, certain types of people who may become criminals? Almost like the movie Minority Report, right, where we can say, you know what, we can see that this person's probably going to commit a crime at some point in time in their lives. Do you feel that that's something that that's possible?
Yes and no. So I think part of my work in forensic psychology is doing violence risk assessments or recidivism risk assessments, particularly with sex offenders. So of course, even psychologists, as cool as we are, we can't predict, predict per se future behavior, but we can use actuarial risk assessments like the HCR 20, the stable 2007, the static 99, which takes into account a bunch of different factors. The age of the victim, how many offenses, how many prior offenses, the age of the perpetrator, all sorts of different factors. And we statistically analyze that information, and it gives us a pretty roundabout picture of the likelihood that somebody will reoffend. So the static 99, which is a sex offender tool, and the stable 2007, another sex offender actuarial risk assessment tool, those are pretty accurate. The research shows that, again, you take into account a bunch of these factors, and I failed statistics twice, so I don't do that stuff. But thankfully, there are some psychologists who do that stuff for us, and you really plug in the numbers, and it tells you this offender, the likelihood of him recidivating or reoffending in the next 3 to 5 years is between 5 to 7%. So we do have tools to kind of foreshadow. I don't know if predict is the right word. We're not there yet.
Got you. And what about in terms of the laws that exist? Right? You mentioned pedophiles, right? Sex offenders. What are the laws that exist right now in Miami-Dade County, if you're familiar with them? I know for a while there was a bunch of sex offenders sleeping along the Julia Tuttle Causeway. Then I know later on there was only a section in East Hialeah in Miami-Dade County where there was an encampment there, and that's where a lot of pedophiles were staying. What are the current laws involving registered sex offenders or people with a history of pedophilia? So that is another backwards issue. And I remember under the Julia Tuttle, they used to call it like rapist camp or something derogatory. Rapist road. Yeah, rapist, yeah, something like that. And I worked with a lot of sex offenders outpatient doing sex offender therapy. And all of them had this problem where, they couldn't be, I'm not familiar with the laws per se right now, but I remember that they couldn't be within a certain distance from a school. They couldn't be within a certain distance of residences or a health community, or they couldn't be any, and when you map that out in a city like Miami, they couldn't be anywhere. It's impossible. What's crazy was that I remember reading that they couldn't be within they couldn't sleep near a school. So the laws involved where they slept, which has nothing to do with it because there's no kids in school while you're sleeping. True. So I remember reading some of those laws, and there's a school everywhere. There's schools everywhere. Yeah, and so of course, as somebody who cares about protecting the community, I get that. Yeah. But again, what's the alternative? Because a lot of these guys that were in my sex offender groups would again be homeless, be under Julia Tuttle, or they would find literally a field in Homestead and buy a little RV or rent a little RV and just be there. And, again, research shows, and I'm absolutely not co-signing any kind of sex offender behavior, but research shows if sex offenders, depending on the particular offender, but if they have
probation and supervision, and they have strict rules in place, and they are in treatment, their chances of reoffending are actually really low. It's like 5 to 7%. So to ostracize them and is actually putting them more at risk of offending, maybe not sexually offending, but offending one way or another. So another gray area where we have to figure out, what do we do here?
So now you take that pedophile, he's no longer in the street, he gets arrested, he ends up in prison. How are those other inmates in general population treating that inmate who has a history of pedophilia?
So,
and how do they find out? That's my question too, right? How do people know about what you've been convicted of?
Great question. So really the prison culture is a complete subculture. It's like a whole nother world. And unless you've worked in it or been an offender, it's really hard to comprehend. But it's very accurately portrayed in the movies that sex offenders are on the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. Pedophiles at the very bottom, and then rapists, and then, the higher up is like gangbangers and murderers. Those guys get all the quote unquote respect, the street cred. How do they find out? It's very easy. There are a lot of correction officers who will snitch, let's just be honest, or even staff members, nurses, therapists who will snitch because of their own internal bias. You can pay to get information. It's very easy. And so it's very easy for other inmates to find out somebody's crime. And they're absolutely treated like scum in prison, bottom of the totem pole for sure.
So tell me a little bit about the subculture in prison itself. Like who's at the top of the totem pole? How do they run? How do the gangs work? I know that sometimes there's skinheads and there's divisions based on culture, ethnicity. I don't know. I'm just curious. I want to know more about it.
So it's interesting because it really differs from state to state. Like, for example, when I was in California, the gang culture there is very prominent. And I remember, like, the first time I went on a prison yard in California, it was like a movie. You had the Sureños over there, the South Mexican, Norteños, the North Mexican over there, the blacks over here, the white supremacists over here, and the Asians over here. And there was no mixing. I mean, if you came in as a white male into prison in California and you didn't align, you could be the most unracist person on the planet. If you didn't align with your white counterparts, you weren't going to survive. So it's almost like
dead.
Yeah, you're dead, beat up, robbed. Just a miserable time in prison. All of that kind of stuff. And so you really have no choice but to align in prison. In Florida, especially South Florida, the gang culture, it's still very prevalent. It's not as cut and dry as I would say in California. But yeah, when you come in, there is kind of an unsaid understanding that based on your ethnicity or the way you look or your background, you have to be over here or you have to be over here, which is funny because, like, I'm French, Indian, Tanzanian, born in Switzerland, raised in New York. So I'm like, if I ever went to prison, who am I hanging with? Because I'm super mixed.
Yeah, where do you go?
I don't know.
Where would I go?
What's your background? I don't know.
I'm Cuban.
But you're Cuban, but you're kind of, fair skinned, but not really too fair skinned, but you're Latino. Like,
so if you saw me, if I'm going to prison right now, where would you say, Adrian, go in that direction? Because if not, you're gonna end up dead. I need guidance here.
Okay, please don't get arrested. Right. What have you done?
These are my confessions.
I would say, well, in South Florida, you'd be okay because there's unfortunately, a large Cuban population in prison. So you'd probably have to end up
just following.
Yeah. And if you spoke Spanish, they would just adopt you.
And so what is that cost of being taken in by them? Like, you're falling into a group.
Yeah, so you're right. Everything has a price, right?
Yeah,
so
because I'm basically being protected,
correct.
Right?
You're being protected. So I guess, the question is, if something happens to them, are you willing to jump in? Are you willing to protect them as well? If you have extra food and he doesn't, are you willing to share it? If he doesn't have money in his commissary, but you do, are you willing to get, there's all sorts of politics and things like that we know nothing about, but it's a very defined system. And even as somebody who's worked in corrections for 20 years, there's some things that I still don't know and still may never know. And some of these gangs are really organized. Like, there was a prison in California that I saw where there were, I don't know if you've seen this, but they have the solitaire boxes on the yard. So you're literally having humans work out or get their fresh air in a cage, right?
Yeah, I've seen that actually, yeah.
So it's like, because the government says they have to have fresh air. Okay, but they're violent and they're unpredictable. So you put them in a cage in the yard, right? These are the worst of the worst. And so you would see like 5 to 10 outside cages, each with an inmate, and they would be working out simultaneously, like military workouts. It was very impressive to watch. I mean, they don't have any contact with each other, but yet they come to the yard and they're doing these simultaneous, like,
all together.
Yeah, push-ups and burpees, and it's like a whole military routine, and you're like, it's amazing. It's, I think the biggest misconception when I first started working in prisons, is that inmates are not very bright, and that is not accurate. Some of these guys are so brilliant. Mm-hmm. You just wonder, like, and I've told them, you're so smart. If you would just apply that knowledge to legal stuff as opposed to illegal stuff, you'd probably be like the next Bill Gates. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Yeah. They're smart.
We actually had a former UFC fighter, current Eagle FC fighter, Erwin Rivera.
Okay.
He was on the podcast maybe like a month and a half ago. He had a first time he has a psychotic break. He has it at home. Both of his sisters are trying to protect him and preventing him from leaving the house. Mm-hmm. This is a trained killer, right? He's a trained fighter, UFC fighter. And so in his state of psychosis, he felt like those weren't really his sisters. There were somebody or a separate entity that was controlling them or impersonating them. And he felt like his life was in danger. Mm-hmm. He proceeded to, I don't know if he stabbed both of them, mm-hmm. but I mean, it was pretty gruesome. Mm-hmm. It was all over ESPN.
Why did I never hear this? I gotta look it up.
Oh yeah, no, and he's fighting currently. So
he's better.
He's good. He's really good. He was former Titan FC champion.
No, but I mean, he's better.
Oh, mentally, yes.
Yeah.
So he even came on. He's still on lithium. I think 600 milligrams.
Okay.
But he was describing he spent 10 months in solitary confinement. So he was placed in prison. From the day that the psychosis happened, the day after, when they interviewed his sisters were defending him right away. Immediately were defending him. And so he went through a whole process to get out. And so I guess by reason of insanity.
Right, right.
So he was able to get out. He's still being monitored. He still has to go to court-ordered treatment. He has to be on at least a medication. So he's on lithium currently. I asked him, aren't you fearing that you're going to have another psychotic break? Mm-hmm. You're dealing with a sport that has heavy violence. A lot of brain injuries occur. You're probably going to get knocked out at some point or another. You're going to be sparring. There's going to be hits to your head. Are you afraid of this? And he's like, no, I'm not afraid because I'm aware of the signs. That lack of sleep that I experienced for 5, 6, 7 days prior to the psychotic break is something I won't let happen again. But I remember he said that in prison, and this is a really smart guy. He told me about how he was playing chess with people in a different area. Yeah,
it's so cool.
How he was communicating with, what do you call them that you flip through with the string?
Fish wire.
Fish wire, yeah. But then one thing he said that stuck to me was commissary is king.
Commissary is king.
And he said
drugs.
He was just saying that he was able to make moves and he felt empowered because of the commissary that he had. And he realized like, oh, this is huge. This is a way that he can get what he needed.
Right.
So yeah, just a bizarre story of somebody who was just recently on.
I totally have to check that out. Yeah. You gotta check out your podcast.
Brilliant guy too. Brilliant. Yeah. Well, we actually haven't posted that one yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I guess I just brought that up because you mentioned how people are extremely intelligent. This guy reads. He's an avid reader. While he was in prison, he said that he took rags and patted a wall because he was teaching himself how to throw the perfect strike. Yeah. So he was using that time to still build up his fighting career, which...
I had an inmate show me how to make a shank out of toilet paper. It was mind-blowing. Like, yeah. So he had one of the lieutenants allowed him to show me because I was so intrigued. I was a little younger. So he had a bucket of ice and a lighter, which if you want to get your hands on a lighter in prison, you can. You can get your hands on anything in prison if you want. A bucket of ice and a lighter, and I think he had some kind of olive oil or something, and he took a bunch of toilet paper, rolled it up, and somehow, I don't remember exactly how he did it, but he lit it on fire, dipped it in ice, lit it on fire, dipped it in ice, lit it on fire. And it was like paper mache. And it was this, and I couldn't believe that this guy had made a shank that can absolutely kill somebody out of toilet paper with ice and some heat and some oil.
Wow.
And I said to him, that's brilliant. Like, I don't condone what it's for, but it's brilliant. Like, again, you could have been like an engineer or something, so it's sad.
What's the most interesting thing that you've seen invented in prison?
I think that's probably the most interesting. Yeah, innovative. I mean, you see weapons that made out of toothbrushes and bed sheets and just, I mean, these guys, if there's a will, there's a way. And I want to shake them and be like, if you applied this motivation and this intelligence to legal stuff, you would be great.
And what about, so you mentioned earlier that you can get anything.
Yeah.
So how are drugs and weapons and all these different things getting into the prison system?
So the number one way they get in is visitors and corrupt staff. And so visitors, you can't, legally, you cannot prohibit somebody from getting a visit unless they've, engaged in some type of behavior where, it's a legal proceeding even in prison. You have to do something wrong to have your visit suspended. So, wives, mothers, girlfriends, friends, sisters, brothers, they will smuggle stuff in through, they will, just to be graphic, they'll put it up inside of them, whatever hole you have, you can stick some drugs in there. You can stick, here's a good story. So there was a crackdown because so many correction officers, and it's pretty bad in Florida because correction officers are pretty poorly trained and poorly paid here in Florida. So, a pack of Newports goes for like $20. So think about it. If you're making $28K a year and an inmate says, bring me a couple pack of Newports, that's $40. You're going to find a way to smuggle it in because you have to feed your family. Again, not excusing their behavior, but, it makes sense. And some of these guys are high-ranking gang members, and they'll get you your money, and they still have contact with outside people. So we saw they started using those the ones they have at the airport, the security things where it's like a human X-ray. Okay. So, and we saw this nurse had basically put like those, they make these really mini cell phones.
Oh yeah.
Super mini. Yeah. They're like literally the size of, she had put 12 cell phones inside of her. And
this was a nurse?
This was a correction officer. But I've seen it. I've seen everybody fall. I've seen it never ceases to amaze me, but I've seen correction officers, nurses, therapists, even a psychiatrist. There was a psychiatrist that I worked with, prominent psychiatrist making $350,000 a year working in corrections in California, who was smuggling in meth to the inmates. I laugh about it, but think about how sad that is. You know what I mean?
What are you doing?
What are you doing? He was struggling with addiction as well, which I get it. We're all humans, and a lot of us struggle with whatever we struggle with. But why smuggle it in? Like, if you're, I've seen, nothing ceases to amaze me anymore.
That's actually what I was going to ask you next. What's the most bizarre shit that you've seen?
The most bizarre shit that I've seen. So we do have a lot of cutters in prison, and not all of them are, borderline or depressed or cutting for internal reasons or due to mental illness. A lot of them cut for secondary gain, right? So they'll cut to get into psych so they can hide out. They can get meds. They can sell meds. There's a hit on them in the yard. They're a sex offender. The reason I love working in prisons is because it's all a chess game, right? 99% of the stuff guys are telling you is bullshit. So it's like always trying to figure out a puzzle.
So how do you differentiate between somebody who's malingering, and is that knowledge that somebody can use outside to find out, is my boyfriend cheating on me? Something like that.
I would say the biggest, yes, of course, there are psych assessments and the MFAS and the SIRS and collateral records. But I think the best way to find out if somebody's full of it is past behavior, right? Or collateral information. Like if you're acting one way at work, but you're acting another way at home, but you're acting another way with your boys. I mean, as humans, we all kind of act a little different, but things like that. Yeah, I love malingering. It's amazing. But so a lot of these guys cut and they end up in psych. And I did have this one patient who was, he was very sick. It was interesting. He was a high-ranking gang member. And he met criteria for antisocial personality disorder, but he also had a really horrific sexual abuse history where his father used to sexually abuse him for years. And he also met criteria for borderline. So he was self-injure. He would self-injure for internal kind of reasons, but he would also self-injure for the secondary gain component. So it was interesting. It was like psychopathy plus borderline plus it was, and he was such a horrible cutter that one day he cut his stomach and he pulled his intestines out and he threw them on the floor. He did that more than once. Yeah. He's still alive.
You saw him?
You're welcome. Yeah. I saw him do it more than once. He was airlifted out of the prison. They would stitch him up. They'd bring him back. And a week later, he'd be doing it again. I mean, he was a severe cutter. Yeah. I've seen guys insert stuff in their penis. I mean, you name it. You name it, I've seen it.
He cut his stomach open, pulled out his intestines, and threw them on the ground.
Yeah.
This sounds like a horror movie.
It was. I mean, I have scrubs that have bleach stains on the bottom from all the bleach they would need to use to clean his blood. I have stories for days. I should write a book.
You should write a book.
Yeah.
I don't even know what's...
I know. I have guys that would stick stuff in their penis. Pens.
I mean, if you're into that sort of thing.
I mean,
guess.
I mean, this wasn't even... And I would ask them, I would say, look, you're trying to get into mental health. I get it.
But why?
But you can just cut your wrist.
Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, or just tell me you're suicidal. You know, tell me you're hearing voices. Just lie to me. But why do you have to go to that such extreme?
And what do they say?
There are a couple of them that are really high on psychopathy that they enjoy the shock factor, right? So I never reacted. I would just kind of shrug and go back to my office. And most of the staff that I worked with, you know, you become desensitized. And you also know that clinically it's not good to react because that's what they want. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a guy would just pull down his inmate uniform and show me something stuck in his penis. And I would go, well, you know, that's your choice. That's your choice. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go to my office now and write a progress note. Thanks a lot.
I'll be back. Yeah.
I'll be back.
I'll be back in a little while. Yeah. Good luck with that.
Right. Good luck with that. Like, I'm not playing this game with you.
My friend Yvette Cardelle, she's a nurse practitioner. I don't know which prison she's working in, but she says the same thing. She's like, sometimes an inmate will like jump up out of his cell and be masturbating in front of her.
All the time.
And she'll just be like, not impressed. Mm-hmm. And she'll keep walking.
Because if you react, you know, especially new therapists that like work under me, they'll like scream or be like, MFer, put that away. Or like,
that's exactly what they want.
That's what they want. How can you disrespect me like that? And it's like, don't do that. You tell them, I'm not tolerating that behavior. You leave, you write them up, consequence for their action, and you move about your day, because or else they've literally elicited the response from you that they want.
And they get that dopamine hit.
Totally.
Right?
Absolutely. We call them gunners in Florida.
Gunners?
Yeah, gunners. They're like, he's gunning, he's a gunner. That's the Florida term. There are different terms in every state. Yeah, and that's a thing. So I've seen many penises unwillingly. I've seen a lot of crazy self-injury, inserted things, guys and girls smuggling stuff up in them. I've seen, horrific drugs and the effects they've had on inmates get smuggled in. I mean, I've really, somebody put a phone charger in their butt. Don't ask. Yeah. So there you go.
No, and it's interesting because you experience all these things, right, that are extremely shocking, sometimes gruesome.
Yeah.
How do you decompress when you go home?
So I actually left the prison system a couple of years ago and went into, full-time forensic private practice because I was realizing, for a couple of reasons. Number one, COVID hit. Number two, I've always wanted to branch out on my own. But number three, I was realizing that I was becoming desensitized. And, we have to kind of work on keeping insight, and I was becoming so desensitized that I was almost losing empathy, and like I just became kind of a robot. Mm-hmm. Guys would tell me I'm suicidal, and I'd be like, if you say so. And I didn't want to become that clinician, because what if he really is suicidal? Mm-hmm. And you're so used to being lied to and bullshitted that I would just roll my eyes and be like, I'm not putting you on suicide watch, and then go back to my office. And it's like, wait a second, Dr. Haji, like you have to. What if he is? And I was noticing that in myself, thankfully, that I was able to have that insight that I was becoming desensitized. But how do I decompress is, it's a process. When I first started working in corrections, I would take a lot of cases home with me and lose sleep over how can I help this inmate, or he's really schizophrenic, I need to help him. And the older you get, the more experience you gain, the more you learn to compartmentalize. I also had a mentor. I used to come home from working for prison before I got my doctorate, and I used to tell her, I'm so tired. Like, I'm tired all the time. Why am I so tired? I'm only working 40 hours a week. I've definitely worked more. And she said, because you're working harder than your patients. And that was a line that always stuck with me. I wanted them to do better for themselves when they didn't even really want it. You know, like I wanted you, like, go to your GED, go to relapse prevention, be better, call your mother. And like, some of them didn't want that. I'm cool. I like being in prison. I'm okay with this. Why are you trying to make me a better human? And I had to learn that the hard way. I was working harder than them to make them different. I was imposing my goals on them. So that was another lesson I learned. And
Sounds
then, of
like
course,
a lot of relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Be better. Be better. But I don't want to be better.
Somebody who's investing all of their time in somebody else and just pushing what their desires are on them. Or, I know you're ambitious. I know you have it in you. I know you can do more. I know that you can be a better person. I know you can be a better boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or whatever it is. But then that person shows no desire.
Yeah, and you're a clinician, so you know what it's like to, like, I want my patient to be better and, I don't know, stop sleeping around or stop self-injuring or go to the gym or lose weight. And it's like, what if they don't, I don't want that, or I'm not motivated for that. So I had to stop doing that. Mm-hmm. And then to decompress, well, like I said, I come home and watch true crime, which is not the most effective thing, but I am who I am. For me, prayer, meditation, exercise, humor. If you can't make jokes about crimes and rapists and suicide, which, you know, most people wouldn't really get that, but humor, having people who also work in prison to bounce humorous stuff off of. If you don't laugh, like, you'll cry. So kind of that balance.
My team sometimes thinks I have a dark sense of humor, and it's because of what you're exposed to. Correct. And then you learn how to cope, right? I worked in pediatric ICU for a while. You're dealing with dying children, and it's not that, and I remember during COVID, nurses were being reprimanded because people were recording them dancing in the morgue or whatever it was.
How else are they supposed to get through the day?
People don't understand that, though. And so from when you take it out of that context, it's just, oh, these people have no compassion. Right. They don't care about humans. It's like, no, this is a survival mechanism for themselves. Because if they take all of that home and they can't make light of this very dark scenario, they're going to be in a living hell.
They're going to burn out.
Yeah, they're going to burn out. They're not going to want to work anymore. Right. So there has to be like a sense of camaraderie where I'm sure that you with other clinicians have said jokes that if you said it out loud or if somebody was recording you and posted it, probably would have been like, or probably would have gotten you fired. Yeah,
or my license reported. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I've made some super inappropriate rape jokes, suicide jokes, murder jokes, gang jokes. But like you said, you're working in a stressful, dangerous environment 40 hours a week. Mm-hmm. If you can't have some kind of humor and levity to get through the day with your coworkers, how are you even human, really? You know, you have to find a bright side to this, or you have to find a way to get through I totally get it with those nurses dancing in the morgue. Yeah, it's not socially appropriate, and don't post it on TikTok, but it's like, how am I supposed to?
Oh, it got posted.
Well, okay.
It got posted. A lot of people lost their jobs. But I knew that it was taken out of context.
Of course, you do.
I understood it, but
most people don't.
Most people don't. Unless you work with people who are suffering, right? It's really hard for you to grasp that concept, right? Where it's just a means of me surviving, me compartmentalizing it, and also saying, man, I have to make light of this very messed up situation. Of course. Just for me. And it's not that I lack compassion, that I lack empathy, that I don't want to help these people. It's that I see it very differently than you might from the outside. Come work in the prison system. Come work in a PICU. Come work in I don't know, wherever. Of course. And then you'll realize, like, oh, you have to. Of course. I should have somebody who works in a morgue in here. Yeah, totally. No, but I'm of course, scared. I'm sure, of course, you know, they chose to work in that field. Mm-hmm. I can imagine having to see kids dying all the time or suffering. How else are you supposed to get through the day? People are so judgmental. They don't get it. They just don't get it. Isn't that, I mean, I think this is a societal issue right now where people are so quick to judge and point the finger without really understanding the context by which things are being said. We're in a current culture of just canceling people for saying anything. Yeah. I think that's just where society is. We're just quick to sever the limb, to amputate, you know, to marginalize people, basically. And cancel culture is ridiculous because you haven't even given somebody an opportunity to learn better. You know, if you know better, you do better. Mm-hmm. If you know better and you don't do better, that's different. Yeah. But this cancel culture idea, I mean, I've made so many mistakes in my life. I could have been canceled a million times. I continue to make mistakes. That's what being a human is. So I agree. I think cancel culture is
unless you've done something completely egregious, like murder your mother, like, do we really have to cancel all these people? You know what I mean? Like, it has to be individualized. Everything has to be individualized. And that's the problem. I'm seeing that we're operating like masses, instead of, we're stereotyping a lot.
And you're active on social media. Why do you think, I don't know, why do you think that people behind a keyboard become so outraged by everything? Like, obviously there's a monitor between you and another person, but why do you think people are just are so angry towards one another?
That's a really good question. And what's funny is that I was very resistant to having a social media account. I don't have Facebook, I don't have Snapchat, I don't have TikTok, I don't have Twitter. I do have my my Instagram, and I was very resistant to that. And it was kind of friends and colleagues that were like, this is the wave of the future. You have to get on social media. And I was like, no, I don't want to be like the dancing psychologist. And they were like, no, you don't have to do that. Not that there's anything wrong with the dancing psychologist, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I was so resistant. I thought those are for the 16-year-olds. And I think it has so many positive benefits, spreading, attacking stigma, spreading information, debunking misinformation, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's something about people being behind a screen that gives them this bravery and this anger. And I've even felt that in myself, where I've seen somebody kind of attack me on a comment or something, and I start to go at it, and I'll totally admit that. And I'm like, wait, Lina, you have to just put the phone down. You don't even know this person. You don't even know where they're coming from. I've totally been subject to it. We're like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm a psychologist. Let me tell you why you're wrong. Yeah. And it's like,
during COVID, I guess I was just putting out different pieces of information, and a lot of them were getting a lot of traction. But every once in a while, I would get like a nasty comment, and so I just opted to hit the Facetime button on Instagram to see if the person wanted to have a conversation.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Nobody wanted to, though. I think I spoke to one dude that I was just like, hey, like, I just wanted to look at you in the face while we had a conversation, as opposed to
good for you.
This battle. Yeah, no, it was.
You're like my idol right now.
Why? No, I think it makes a lot more sense, right?
It does.
Because once you take that away, and now you're looking at facial expressions, you're seeing it's a human there. Your tone changes, your demeanor changes.
Yeah, everything.
Like, if somebody's sitting in front of you and you have a disagreement, you're not just throwing insults at them. You're going to have a conversation. You're going to share what your thoughts are. They're going to share those thoughts, and that's it. Polo and I have been having conversations about different aspects, whether it's about our views on certain transgenders in sports, right? We were having that conversation the other day. If I have that conversation via a keyboard versus me and him sitting across from one another, it may go very differently.
Absolutely.
But like, just listen to where I'm coming from. I'm listening to where you're coming from. All right. I mean, I guess right now we don't disagree. Later on that night, he sends me articles like via text message, and I'm like, okay, cool. I'll look at these later. But that's it. We go on about our day. There's no anger or resentment or hatred.
It's still your friend or your colleague.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's brilliant. I never even thought about that, because for you to have that insight and go ahead and be brave enough to say, I want to talk to you as another human being, not as just this faceless. That's awesome. That's brilliant.
Well, think about it when you're have you ever been in a fight with somebody via text message, and sometimes your words are completely misconstrued?
Yes, for sure.
Hit the Facetime button.
You're absolutely right.
That's just my strategy.
That's like the best piece of advice I've gotten in a long time.
Really?
Yeah.
I charge for this.
Yeah, no problem. No. Put it on my tab. No, they don't call you doctor for nothing.
No. I don't even know. I was gonna actually another post that I wrote once that said actually what you mentioned earlier. I said past behaviors are predictors of future behaviors. Period.
People went nuts.
Or are you trying to say people can't change? I'm like, nah, people absolutely can change, but usually we fall into routines and rituals, and our behaviors are ingrained in us sometimes. And for people to change, it's difficult. It's not easy, right? That's why when people start a weight loss program or a diet or try to go back to school or try to do different things, and it's not like it's simple for you right away. It takes a lot of work for you to just find that routine, find those habits. To go back. If
change was easy, everybody would do it overnight.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think past behavior is absolutely the best predictor for future behavior. And of course we believe people change, or we wouldn't be in the field that we're in.
Exactly.
Of course we believe in change, or else...
You'll get hate mail, though.
Yeah, you will. I will get hate. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I think, of course, people can change, but I agree that there are some things that are absolutely ingrained. You might just direct them differently. Anger, for example. I've worked with a lot of very, very angry inmates who finally found an outlet. It could be something as cliche as boxing. Instead of hitting my peers, I'm going to hit the bag, and so you redirect that energy. I mean, that's life changing, but it's still kind of the same source, if you will. I mean, maybe that's a bad example, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's still violent,
right?
Still violence
Right.
in nature, but the outcome is different. You're not taking out somebody else.
Right.
You're not lashing out somebody who's not expecting it. Like
Correct.
it's the context by which you're releasing
Correct.
that violence.
Right.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
It is interesting.
And I noticed that you've gone from New York to California to now South Florida, right? So what has made you travel that way, just across the states?
It wasn't by choice. So I'm a New Yorker for life. Us New Yorkers are unwell, and we represent New York till we die. So my family and friends are still in New York. I grew up in New York. I came down to South Florida for my doctorate. I got into Albizu, and that's why I moved down here. And then California, I just matched with pre-doc, was in Cali. I stayed there for fellowship. I hated the part of California that I was in, even though the prison system really was impressive, and actually the pay was better. And I just knew I wanted to come back to the East Coast. So in 2018, as soon as I got licensed in Florida, I was like, I'm out of here. So it seems like I happened to travel a lot, but it was really all school related. Doctorate, pre-doc, post-doc, and then I wanted to be back on the East Coast.
How does the your job as a clinician in the prison system, working forensic psychology, differ from a private practice in forensic psychology?
So I think, and they're starting to make a distinction with this in the APA. They're starting to call it correctional psychology versus forensic psychology, which I used to think was kind of the same thing, as long as you're working with criminals, like same thing. But correctional psychology is much more what I just talked about, being a clinician in corrections and doing suicide risk assessments, running groups, individual therapy, I use that term loosely, evaluations, intakes, biopsychosocials, things like that. Forensic psychology is completely different in the sense that I no longer work in corrections. I might go to evaluate an inmate and leave, but really my job is much more evaluative, and it's much more with the courts. So I'm not really, running a group for sex offender inmates in the yard. I'm going to the jail to interview this defendant to see if he's competent to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity. I also do some law enforcement screenings. I think I told you that. Is this person fit to be a police officer? There's a lot of heightened awareness on that after George Floyd, which is a good thing. And so it's very different because I'm doing a lot. I'm not doing treatment anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm really kind of seeing people once and then I'm leaving, which is better for my mental health, Yeah. But also making a difference in a different way. It makes me feel really good when I can know that I played a role in sending a really ill guy to a hospital as opposed to a prison. Mm-hmm. That helps me sleep at night. They want to charge this guy with, we want to charge him with murder. He's a lifer. Okay, but it's kind of like the example you talk about. But he was completely floridly psychotic. He was paranoid. He didn't know what he was doing. He has lifelong schizophrenia. Of course, it's horrible somebody died, but this guy needs to be in a psych hospital, not prison. And so that's where I get more satisfaction now. So that's the main difference between corrections and forensic. Forensic is a lot more evaluative, court system answering a legal question. Corrections is much more actual clinical work in a prison or in a correctional facility.
How do you determine, I guess, the traits of a police officer, or what are some of the tests that you do with police officers in order to determine that they would be a competent police officer?
So again, thanks for me, because I'm not research oriented and not research heavy. I have a PsyD, not a PhD. I despise research, but thankfully there are psychologists who do research for me, as you know. So I usually give the INWALD, which is a personality test, and it measures things like conscientiousness, dependability, team attitudes, any kind of misogyny or sexism. I give the PSR, which is the Protective Services Report, which is specialized.
Aren't those things embedded in the culture currently?
Yes, but you'd be surprised. Yeah. I interviewed a candidate for a police officer position about 2 months ago, and we were on telehealth, and I'm doing the clinical interview, and I said, kind of, why do you want to be a cop in Key West? He said something like, well, there aren't a lot of Jews down here. And I'm like, dude, like, what? Like, I'm supposed to be like, even if you really believe that, you're going to say that to your psychologist that's evaluating you to make sure you're not racist as a cop. Like, obviously I didn't recommend him for the position, but like, people are not as, there's not a lot of Jews down here, so I'd rather be a cop down here. I was like, okay, all right. So are you going to George Floyd a Jew if you get the position?
Yeah,
like, what is that? No, Dr. Mesa, it's not as embedded as you think it is. People are just, and some guy, I've had all sorts of crap. People are crazy. You know this. I've had one guy who was like, just standard questions, any history of substance abuse. Oh yeah, I used to smoke weed in high school, or I did experimental drugs in college. That's one thing. And this guy goes, well, I mean, I mess around with cocaine every couple of months. And I'm like, dude, you can't be a cop doing cocaine. Like, what?
Just like
what
that.
Yeah.
Just matter
and he
of
just
fact.
said it like, I'm ready to go to police academy. I was like, bro.
You're not going
like,
anywhere.
I'm not trying to judge you on your recreational drug use, but at the same, you can't be.
You can't be a cop.
You can't be a cop. You can't just be doing blow on Saturdays and then just go. So, no, it's not as automatic as you think it is.
He'll find a kilo in somebody's trunk and just take it home and be like, yeah, I can use this later.
Yeah. Or, yeah, exactly. Or, they'll spike on things like volatility, impulsivity, paranoid. You don't want a paranoid cop because that's somebody who's going to be trigger happy. Mm-hmm. So different dimensions of these awesome tests to make sure that they kind of, and some of these tests even, they even say like this person is recommended for a position in public safety. This person is not recommended for such and such reasons.
I have a super cool question on that. So if a cop is like the one that does cocaine,
mm-hmm.
is there a way that you can, like, he can lie about it and you can tell? Or is it only ever like he could lie and you don't know? So
that's a really good question. That would be kind of similar to an inmate malingering, faking symptoms. A lot of these tests pick up, unless you're a very sophisticated liar, a lot of these tests, the MMPI, the INWALD, they can pick up on what's called impression management. So even though he won't spike on substance abuse, he'll spike on the lie scale. So, and they're not 100%. And, again, if you're a really sophisticated liar, you might get away with it. But if you're a guy doing doing cocaine every month or so, you're probably going to spike on substance abuse or spike on the lie scale, or there's going to be some kind of indication somewhere, hopefully, and if you don't spike and you get away with it and you end up being a cop on cocaine, good for you. Then I didn't do my job. I don't know. You know what I mean? Good luck with that.
But usually doesn't it find like inconsistencies in responses?
Yeah. Inconsistencies in response. Are you faking good? Are you faking bad? So, but that's a great question. There are a lot of tests that can measure for that stuff, thankfully. Yeah. Yeah. Well, does cocaine on Saturdays count? Well, yes, it does. Yes, actually.
It might count. I had a question I completely drew a blank. Oh, I know what I was going to ask. Do you ever feel that you have failed the system at all in terms of either you felt as though somebody committed a crime intentionally, but their plea for insanity went through, or vice versa, where they were convicted and you knew that clinically they were not well and they were imprisoned rather than put into an institution?
Thankfully, I haven't come across that just yet, or anything super egregious, because as you know, it's usually a little bit more gray, right? So even though he's psychotic, he still knew kind of what he was doing, or he was also smoking meth at the time, and he's got to be accountable for that. So usually it's a little bit gray. So I haven't had any case where it's like, oh my God, I can't believe they put him in prison and he's so sick and I need to call the Innocence Network, because I would really probably like go full force. I hate injustice. Injustice drives me nuts. And of course we see it all the time, but I haven't seen anything really bad yet, knock on wood. But
how many prisoners claim that they were wrongfully convicted?
Very, very few.
Very few?
Very, very few.
Most of them fess up and say,
most of them fess up. What you hear more than wrongfully convicted is they shouldn't have given me this much time, which fair. I sold some drugs, but like 15 to 20, and you'll be like, okay, I get that. But like, you also have a rap sheet the size of my dissertation, dude. Like, they were fed up with you, As far as coming across inmates who are absolutely 100%, I'm innocent, I didn't do this. it's much more Hollywoodified, I think, than, or they'll be doing time for something that they didn't do, but there's 10 other things that they never got caught for
Gotcha.
that they'll tell me. Like, yeah, they took me, I got time for this robbery. I wasn't even there. It was my boy. But, I did other robberies that I never got caught for. So fair enough.
So
I'm
I'll take it.
Dude, yeah.
So I'll take this one. I'll take the rap for this one.
Yeah, and so it's sad. But usually, by the time somebody gets to prison, barring that it's their first time and they never had any prior arrests, which is pretty rare, they've done some stuff,
Why aren't we doing a better job with corrections officers? Like, I know that there's a ton of money that these systems are making. You're saying that the corrections officers are falling into corruption because of their low wages or for whatever reasons. I mean, you did mention a psychiatrist who's making $350K and still smuggling meth, but
California.
So for the most part, why do you think they're just not either training them better? Well, both training them better and paying them more if they're making so much money.
And not only that, you have to, you can say what you want about correction officers, and Lord knows that I've had my differences with correction officers. They're risking their lives every day. They're doing a job that nobody wants to do.
My brother's wife is actually a corrections officer.
So you know what I mean? Like, you're walking into a prison, the most dangerous place on the planet, every day, risking your life, and you're essentially a babysitter for psychopaths and the worst of the worst in society. So that alone, even if correction officers don't have the best reputation, like that alone should be financially rewarded, because it's some of these correction officers don't go home to their families. Like, it's very dangerous. And I have some correction officer colleagues that I do have a lot of respect for, that they do things by the book, that they're not corrupt. And, I'm not saying they're all horrible. I don't want to spread that message at all. I think that what it boils down to is, again, inmates are the forgotten population. Nobody cares. Nobody thinks about inmates. You did a crime. You did the time. You should have thought about that before you did whatever. And so with correction officers, it's kind of the same as what I was talking about before. Like, why would anybody want to spend money on COs? Like, those are for inmates. Who cares about inmates? But I'll tell you the biggest difference. I remember in Florida, I know that at one point they were making like $28,000 a year. In California, they start at like $65,000 a year. Granted, the cost of living in California is typically higher, but 65 for, is respectable. How are you supposed to feed a family of 4 on 20? You can't, in a city like Miami, what? And I remember when I got to pre-doc in the prison in California, there was a DBT unit. And there was an inmate that was punching the wall. He was having a meltdown. He was breaking down. He was punching the wall. And in Florida, if you're an inmate punching the wall, the COs they're gonna beat your ass. Like, cut your crap. I'm beating your ass, and you're going to the hole. That's end of story. And in California, there was a correction officer who was on the DBT unit who was trained in DBT as a coach, and he started doing breathing exercises with the inmates and calmed him down. And I was in the twilight zone. I was like, oh my God, I've never seen that in my life. Like, the correction officer didn't come and beat his ass, cuff him, and put him in the hole. He coached him through it, told him it's all right. They did breathing exercises. He calmed the inmate down, and end of story. And I was like, wow, like, that gave me hope, because it's like, see, corrections can be better. It can be. And I'm not saying every inmate can be calmed down with breathing exercises.
Yeah, but they have to be trained with de-escalation techniques, learn different modalities of, hey, how can I extinguish this fire that's going on?
Right, but usually they add fuel to it. I mean, in a lot of places, and they some of these correction officers are high on psychopathy as well, and they enjoy taking their anger out on inmates, and it's really kind of, and again, I don't want to paint a negative picture for correction officers. I really don't, because Lord knows that they kept me safe for years, and so I don't want to do that at all. But the point is, like, you can pay them better. You can train them more efficiently. You can make prison a safer place. You can reduce staff assaults and inmate assaults. But I think nobody cares. And why would they put money into that,
How common is rape culture in prison? So I have a couple of uncles. Shout out to all my uncles who've been in prison.
That's awesome.
But I never... When I talk to them about it, they just kind of brush me off, right? And I'm not going to be intrusive.
Of course.
But I'm always curious to know. I want to know a little bit more about what their experience was like. And then in Hollywood, you always see, like, rape culture is huge. Like, everybody's getting raped. Or you do something wrong, like, you're going to get gangbanged, right?
Yeah.
So is that...
And the prison jokes. Like, okay, bend over.
Yeah,
like,
bend over, don't drop the soap.
Yeah, right, all that.
So is that legitimately what occurs, or is it not as common as what's depicted on TV?
So interestingly enough, it's actually, yes, it does occur, and it occurs way too often. And oddly enough, the stigma with men reporting sexual abuse in community is very much prevalent in prison as well. So a lot of guys won't report it. I don't think we have an accurate number, or that I've ever had an accurate account of how often it happens, because there's still shame in that. And my manhood has been taken, or I'm a punk, or whatever crazy, not crazy, but erroneous ideas go behind men being sexually assaulted. So I've never really actually gotten a good grasp on that. But what I understand is more prevalent and is not spoken about is more, and I use this term loosely, consensual sex in prison. But when I say consensual, is it really consensual? Because usually it's coercion, right? Protection, or money, or whatever it is. So it is prevalent, unfortunately. PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, it seems has helped with it somewhat, but I think it's largely unreported. And so there are times where it's happened and it's never been brought to my attention, even as clinical director, as psychologist, as therapist. So I can't give an accurate assessment, but it happens for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even myself as a man. I don't know. Would I report it?
Right.
Right.
Even as a woman in a female prison, where I know that the sexual assaults take their place there too, I'm thinking, would I report it?
Did you always work in a male dominant? Did you always work in the men's side? Yeah.
I worked in a female prison for about a year, and it was interesting. It was very different. Very different in some ways, not so different in others. It was very clean. Female inmate,
really?
Oh my God, they had flowers everywhere, and they were very about their yards, and it was very different.
That's so bizarre.
Yeah, it is bizarre.
I just don't even, just being in prison itself, when Erwin was in here and he was talking about it, thinking about being in a cell, to me, I don't know. I don't know how I would feel, how I would react. Yeah, I don't know.
I think our survival instincts kick in, but I can say that, there is, in Florida, you have to certify the suicide cells. They have to be certified by a psychologist. So we have to go in there and make sure there are no outlets, no, things hanging off the wall where somebody could hang themselves. It has to be a very flat wall. Like, we have to actually, I don't know why it falls on the psychologist. It should fall on the correction stuff. Anyway. And so part of that process of certifying a cell for suicide precautions is you have to lock yourself in it for a couple minutes and see if there's anything you could do if you wanted to hurt yourself or kill yourself. And I've done that a couple times, and just in 2 minutes being locked in that cell, I'm like,
get me out.
Yeah. I mean, close to a panic attack. Just, I have to remember this when I deal with my patients. I have to remember that just this alone is enough to traumatize someone. Forget everything else.
I think that's so important, because when I was at Camilla's house, there was what differentiated myself and the team that I worked with from a lot of the other clinicians is that we worked on a project called the Lazarus Project, where we were literally going out to the street to help the homeless, like atop their cardboard box, versus the system up until then was they came into a regular office appointment, which doesn't make sense for the homeless population, where like they don't have a sense of time. They have to choose between, am I going to eat, or am I going to go to this appointment, or I need to find shelter, I don't feel safe, or it's raining, or etc. So we were just going
transportation, all of it,
everything, all these different things. And who am I to think as a clinician that person's priority is to make it on time
you're
to their
late.
Appointment? Yeah,
it's like, I don't have a house.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's good, because I had that lived experience of sitting next to them, looking at their environment, and I understood their world a little bit differently because I was in it.
Totally,
I was immersed in it. And I think it's the same for a clinician like yourself, where you need to see or feel what general population feels like day to day, and where do the fights break out, and why do they happen, and you're suffering from insomnia, but what's it like at night?
Exactly. Right? How do you sleep in a prison?
How do you feel safe sleeping in a prison?
Exactly.
Do you go into REM?
Right. Probably not.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think I could go. I mean, I sleep like a rock, but I don't know that I would go into REM in a prison.
Especially if you feel like your life is being threatened, somebody's coming after you.
Or it's open dorm.
You didn't snitch, you didn't give up your commissary.
Right.
Woo.
Yeah. And I think PTSD is extremely underdiagnosed in prison. we're so quick to, oh, you're angry, you're bipolar, or, you're malingering, or you're this, you're that. And it's like, wait a second. Like you said, there's so many factors to consider just being in prison. How can you be normal? Or you can't.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
You could diagnose me with paranoia right away.
Me too. Paranoia, panic attacks, major depression, you name it.
So some of the things that you put out, like Misdiagnosis Mondays, why do you think that's, I love it, but why do you think that's necessary?
Oh my God, misdiagnosis is my pet peeve. I think that the amount of misdiagnosis that happens in our field is egregious, and I don't know why nobody does more about it. I mean, in the medical field, if you have a headache and somebody says, it's a migraine instead of a brain tumor, that's a big problem. Like, why are we not looking at misdiagnosis in mental health the same way? I feel like, and I saw this so much in corrections with poorly trained staff and, people who just really didn't care and are just quick to label someone. And don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware that diagnosis is not the be all and end all, and that the DSM-5 is not the be all and end all, but it's a foundation, and it's a way for clinicians to communicate with each other. And so, what I see a lot is malingered people who malinger getting diagnosed with schizophrenia. They'll go to a psychiatric person and say, I hear voices, and there's no further asking, no thorough clinical interview. Okay, here's Haldol. And it's like, do you know what antipsychotics do to people who are not psychotic? Like, that's not okay. Or the worst one I see is, I'll ask an inmate, what's your diagnosis? Oh, I'm bipolar. Okay. Tell me what makes you think you're bipolar. Well, like, I wake up in the morning and I'm in a really good mood, and then in the afternoon, if my girlfriend hasn't written to me, I'm like really angry. I'm like, dude, that's not bipolar. That's called life. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? But you go to a practitioner who's not thorough, who doesn't care, and you say, well, yeah, I'm moody, which is not even bipolar, and they'll write a prescription. Disorder. And then that diagnosis carries them over and over, and it's not getting them the proper treatment. Borderline personality disorder needing DBT versus bipolar needing lithium, those are two completely different treatments. And I think you see a lot of patients with treatment fatigue where they're like, I'm just not getting better. You're not getting better because you're not bipolar. You're not schizophrenic. You don't have autism or ADHD. ADHD is another huge one. I can't focus. Well, this is one. I was doing a child evaluation recently, and the mother said, my kid has ADHD. I said, okay, well, the kid was obese for one. Mm-hmm. What does your kid do after school? Oh, they watch TikTok for 3 hours. Oh, okay. What do they eat for lunch? Oh, peanut butter and jelly, mac and cheese, and Twinkies. Oh, okay. How much are they sleeping? And it's just, you look at all these lifestyle things. He doesn't have ADHD. He has poor parenting. Excuse me. Turn off the television and maybe he'll be able to focus. Does he do any sports? No. And so, I mean, I'm rambling, but I think misdiagnosis is so bad for patients, and they carry that for them for life.
Yeah, because now that parent is so, let's say you're that clinician, diagnoses the kid with ADHD. You haven't looked at all of these lifestyle issues that the child should work on. Now the mom is only fixated on whether or not this medication is working to help the child. So you have done a complete disservice to the child because you've never identified all these lifestyle issues and parenting issues that should have been addressed first. But
here's the Ritalin. Here's math.
Here's math. But at least I can speak. I've only been a clinician in South Florida in terms of mental health. And I think down here, people want the quick fix. I don't know if it's the same as true in New York or California. I can say down here, people, we can go through all these lifestyle issues. We can talk about, hey, what is your day-to-day life like? Mm-hmm. What are your behaviors? What are your outlets? What are your hobbies? What else are you doing? And it's like Netflix, isolation,
TikTok,
beer, TikTok, phone, movies, sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Or
insomnia. Of course you're depressed.
Yeah.
Of course you're depressed. You don't have any actual stimuli. And that's what I was telling this mother. Like, this poor child, he was 8. He's not exercising. He's eating a ton of sugar, which, of course, when you have sugar, you look like you have ADHD at 8 years old. He has no, he's not socializing. He's not going to the park and playing with people. I don't know about you, but me at age 8, I was running around the park like a maniac. Yeah. That was good for me. Mm-hmm. And so she really was just like, well, we need an appointment with the psychiatrist so I can get him on Ritalin. And I was like, no, man. Like, no. Absolutely not. And of course, the testing came out that he was an ADHD.
So what do you say to that parent, right? Where you say, oh, why don't you put your child in a sport or get them engaged in social activities or get them out in the park? And they just say, he doesn't want to. He just wants to stay in his room.
Yeah, he doesn't like it.
He doesn't like to. He just wants to stay in his room. What do you say to that parent?
I mean, we can only do so much, right? You can only lead a horse to water. I make sure I document it.
Yeah.
I put it in the eval. Child does not meet criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It appears that problems are due to a sedentary lifestyle. I'll recommend parenting training. I'll recommend joining a sport. I'll put those things in recommendations in my eval. I don't just put go to therapy and go see a psychiatrist. I put everything. Play, trim down phone time from 3 hours a day. Let's start with 1 hour a day, and just I'll put those recommendations so that if and when the kid, 5 years later is still on Ritalin, has diabetes, is morbidly obese, and is getting made fun of in high school, at least I can say, well, I tried. You know what I mean? Not to sound like, oh, I'm just covering my own ass, but really, you can only lead a horse to water. And I try to tell these parents, like, take him outside after school. Maybe he won't seem like he has ADHD. He's bored. And yeah.
Not that you're an expert in childhood obesity, but where are we failing our kids as a society in terms of like just the sedentary lifestyle, the lack of socialization?
I think the phones are huge, and I'm guilty of it too. When I'm in a mood where I don't feel like doing anything, I'll find myself scrolling for hours. It's like, Lina, what are you doing? Like, put the phone. I'm guilty of it, absolutely, and I think we all are. That being said, I think that I don't know really what it is. For me, athletics were. I actually just posted something about this today. For me, exercise has been my Prozac through my as soon as I could walk. I was a gymnast. I played basketball. I kickboxed. I did CrossFit. I do yoga. For me, if I can't exercise, I don't feel the same way. Not compulsively 7 days a week nothing like that. But that needs to be implemented in educational curriculums. We have PE, but it needs to be, I think it needs to be implemented. Nutrition education needs to be implemented. Sleep hygiene needs to be implemented because like you said, everybody's looking for the quick fix. I have ADHD. I need Ritalin. I'm depressed. I need Prozac. I'm moody. I need, I'm bipolar and all that. It's like, no, that's not how this works. And I think people are over pathologizing themselves these days. I've met a few teenagers who actually want a diagnosis from me because it would, and I understand they want to be heard, they want to be understood, but some of them because it's kind of trendy.
So they could go and tell their friends.
Yeah. I started cutting. Why are you cutting? I'm borderline. No, that's not how this works. It's not cutting is not the staple of borderline. It's the chronic abandonment issues. But I've met at least 5 teenagers who are like, I'm cutting, I'm borderline. I'm like, what? Why do you want to be borderline? Why do you want to cut? I don't. It's another world out there. It's really weird. It's odd.
I've seen cutting spread in schools from higher socioeconomic classes. Where one kid starts cutting and then it just becomes like a little epidemic within the school. Yeah,
it's like a trendy thing. I mean, they'll be vaping and cutting at the same time, and it's like, I don't understand. What do we do? What's going on?
Is this just learned behaviors? Why does that happen?
Your guess is as good as mine, but I think, you're so impressionable at that age. And, there's something great about everybody talking about mental health. I know that Demi Lovato came out as borderline and Pete Davidson came out as borderline. And, I think that's great. I think that social media awareness, attacking stigma is fantastic. But we need to be careful to not make it trendy and cool and to also understand that that there's so much misinformation out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so, these teenagers saying, I'm cutting, I'm borderline. I'm like, I who told you that? Oh, well, I saw it on TikTok or I saw it on Demi Lovato, whatever, whoever the trendy kid I'm out of the loop.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I used to tell, especially, patients from across the lifespan was, sometimes if I was not sure about their diagnosis and that's what they wanted, a definitive box to be placed in.
Right.
And I would just tell them, I don't know what your diagnosis is. And honestly, I don't care.
Right.
My job is to improve your quality of life. And we'll target these symptoms that you're experiencing and see what we could do within the confines of that. And people would sometimes be frustrated by a lack of diagnosis as they left the office. But in the same token, an insurance company doesn't pay me
Right.
unless I place a diagnosis in the chart.
Right.
So it's like this catch-22 where I don't want to label the child or label the individual.
But you want them to get services.
I want them to get services, and I need, in order to bill the insurance company, I need a diagnosis.
Insurance companies is the devil, and I'm with you, and that's why I love
Insurance companies. You are my livelihood. I love you all.
Yes, I didn't mean that. Dr. Mesa loves insurance companies.
We're not worthy.
We're not worthy. But that's why, even though I am personally diagnostic heavy because I use it a lot in my practice, I agree with you. Diagnosis is not the be all and end all. DSM-5 is not the be all and end all. It is just a label, because I've never met two bipolar people who present the same way, two schizophrenic people who present the same way, two borderline people who present this. Everybody's individualized. And I think that's the other challenge that I've seen lately, that treatment and evaluation, it has to be individualized. This person might meet criteria for BPD for these reasons. They might meet criteria for BPD for these reasons, but you're two different people. And that's not taken into account enough, I think. People want to be put in a box. I don't know why.
I think we just want answers.
And that makes sense.
Yeah, we just want definitive answers, and that way, because we feel that now we can go home and Google something specifically and see, what am I supposed to do now?
Right, that's true.
Yeah.
But that's the internet life. I mean, wanting answers is one thing, and that makes sense. But answers are not always black and white, like everything else in life.
That's why I tell everybody, especially the students that come through here, I'm like, some of them transition from like infectious disease or something that they draw a lab, or ortho where they get an x-ray and an MRI it's this. And I'm like, guys, I'm so sorry to tell you, this
mental
is so
health
gray.
is not like that.
This is a very gray field. And if you don't like gray, you can't work mental health.
You can't.
So.
You can't. And that's one of my challenges in forensics. Because, for example, insanity. Insanity is not a clinical term. It's a legal term. So the lawyers are like, is he insane or is he not insane? And I'm like, well, it's more common. They don't care. Is he insane? Yes or no? And I'm like, well.
Yeah, you start talking about capacity and competence.
Right. And you're like, well, he does have psychosis. However, he has insight and a little bit of judgment. And if his mood is not anhedonic, and the judge is like, I don't care.
Yeah.
Insane, yes or no? And I'm like, God.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest challenges in applying psychology to the law, because they're so black and white and we're so gray.
So this is the field we chose, right?
Yeah.
Or the field chose us.
Both.
Yeah, it's true. Do you guys have any questions for Dr. Haji?
Do you ever take this into your personal life? Like, do you ever talk to people and like analyze them like you would like?
Oh God, you get this question all the time.
Are you a psych? Are you reading my mind?
Yeah.
I mean,
But I just feel like if you're in that for 40 hours a week, like, how difficult is it to disconnect from that?
I mean, I think because of all the training we have, you can't help but be like, he's lying, or something's wrong with her, or he's definitely got narcissistic traits. Like, you can't help it because you have the language for it in your head. But as far as like, am I, or, kind of analyzing people, so to speak, all the time? No,
But yes.
No, but yes. Yeah. No, but yes. Yeah. No, but yes. But it's not always clinical. It's also human. Like, that guy's an asshole. I don't want to talk to him. I don't know if he meets criteria for narcissist. I don't know if he's a psychopath, but I don't like him. It's not always clinical. It's human too, kind of.
As far as depictions of the field in like film and TV, what would you say are some of the most accurate depictions that you've seen, and where are some of the most inaccurate?
So profiling is not my area. Profiling is very specialized. Criminal profiles, they look at a scene and they analyze the scene and they pick an offender, kind of like, what's it called? Criminal Minds. Have you guys ever watched Criminal Minds? Or Mindhunter? Mindhunter. He was my professor, actually. Yeah, I know. So cool. I've also had some famous serial killers as my patients. Unfortunately, I'm bound by HIPAA, but I'll tell you off the air. Maybe not. Once they sign a release. Once they sign a release.
The Gacy tapes?
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. So I think that Criminal Minds, even though it's Hollywoodified, is actually pretty accurate when it comes to profiling. I had a professor who was an FBI profiler at Quantico, and she said it was pretty spot on. And then you guys are probably too young for this, but Silence of the Lambs, Clarice. Oh my God.
We literally made a joke that when you came in here.
I'm Clarice? Clarice is still my idol this many years later. I've heard that that's pretty accurate. As far as forensic psychologists, I can't think of too many. I don't know. Can you think of anybody who plays a psychologist who has it down pat? Not really.
Or even like prison shows like Orange is the New Black.
Orange is the New Black is completely inaccurate. You know what was more accurate? What's the one from Australia? It's awesome. The female. I have to Google it. There's a female prison show in Australia. Oz. Oz was violent as all hell, but Oz had some accurate stuff in there. Hierarchy and subculture and drugs and kind of personalities. I mean, it was over the top, but Oz was pretty accurate too. Yeah. SVU, God bless your daughter. SVU, I mean, I'm not a cop. I don't work in law enforcement, but a lot of the way they portray the sexual offenders is pretty accurate, I think. Very different from like your meek, quiet pedophile to like your stranger rapist. And one more story. I worked at a sex
rapist. Oh.
Yeah, pointed.
Yeah, I'm like,
That's
whoa,
not
whoa.
okay.
What's going
So
on?
I did have, you asked me about a crazy case, and I told you about a guy who pulled his intestines out. But I did have a serial killer at a sex offender hospital in another state who was found with 30 vaginas in his freezer. Good times. What? So my question was like, was it the whole vagina? Was it just the labia? Was it like, what's going on here?
Mental image that popped in my head.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, I could never take that out.
Maybe he just like roast beef.
Yeah, maybe. Well, when you hear 30 vaginas in your freezer, when you hear 30 vaginas in the freezer, what are you picturing?
I just feel like this podcast is really losing it right now.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, it's fine.
You guys wanted stories. There you go. 30 vaginas in his freezer.
I just want to have roast beef sandwiches all of a sudden.
Really? Do you?
No.
We should call this episode 30
Honestly,
vaginas in a
The
freezer.
first episode we titled just so that we can title it 30 vaginas.
You need to.
You're not going to title it 30
It's
vaginas?
a t-shirt. It's a brand. A lanyard.
And then people just start reading it. 30 vaginas.
Ashley, do you have any questions?
I actually do. So my dad was a corrections officer, so I'm hearing all these things that he never like really spoke about. So
Ooh, tell your dad I'm so sorry.
No, I'm like kind of like concerned to see if like
Is your dad corrupt?
like the trauma that goes into working in that environment that he doesn't talk about. So it's like, do you think that there should be like a program for corrections officers,
Absolutely.
or retired corrections officers that they should go through?
Absolutely, and God bless your dad. Because if I made it seem like I'm harsh on correction officers, I didn't mean to. Like I said, they protected my life for 20 years. I think that a lot of correction officers, struggle with a lot of substance abuse, kind of like regular community cops, law enforcement officers. There's a lot of first responders. There's a lot of high rate of substance abuse because they are exposed to so much and see so much, and then must come home and you have to shut it off, right? Because how else are you going to be a dad and a husband and a productive member of society? And but yeah, I think there's probably I can't speak for your dad obviously, but there's probably a lot of stuff that he would not want you to know. I used to come home and tell my mom and my sister my prison stories until I realized like I don't think they want to hear this. You know, like 30 vaginas in a freezer. Like my mom's like, do you want salad? Yes or no? And it's like, you know, I had to realize like roast beef. I had to realize like this information is not for everybody. You can talk about it on a podcast and you can talk about it with your colleagues and you can have those jokes, but not everybody wants to hear this stuff.
Yeah, people don't know what to do with that information.
They don't know what to do with that information. And I'm so desensitized to it that I can say 30 vaginas in a freezer and just shrug my shoulders, but people don't want to hear that stuff. And so I'm sure your dad was really looking out for you and for himself. Like he probably had to shut down so he could come back and be a normal human being.
I mean, even working in PICU, I think there's so many career paths where you don't realize that you're constantly exposed to trauma. And I didn't realize I had PTSD till years later. I was like, wait, I was having nightmares, of children dying, of drownings, of gunshot wounds.
And you didn't realize, huh?
I didn't pick up on it because I was just going to work. And then I would be like, wow, that was a screwed up dream. But then I was dissociating or...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was as a result of working PICU. So I'm even curious to know not only about corrections officers, but about nurses.
Yeah, anybody who works in that
ERs,
environment. Yeah.
even the nursing assistants in a hospital setting, in the prison system. There's probably so many career paths that we don't even realize that are directly related to PTSD or being exposed to so many traumatic events that people might be experiencing PTSD and don't even know it.
Or not even if it's full-blown PTSD. I mean, I think we as humans are pretty resilient, but I have a friend who's a firefighter, and he does the same thing. He tells me stories about car crashes that I don't want to hear, that they, how he had to pull a 5-year-old out of the back of a car. And I'm like, I don't want to hear that. And he's like, wait a second, but you talk about pedophile and child rape all day. And I'm like, that's different. That's different. That's totally entertaining. I can't hear that other stuff. And then I think you're right. There are a lot more careers in the service, human service industry, where we should have more talk about it, more debriefing, more consultation, more kind of openness about it. We don't.
And what probably happens is what you experienced, where you said at the very beginning of this podcast, where you just felt numb and desensitized to everything. And I bet your dad probably experienced that.
Totally.
I experienced that in PICU. I've spoken to first responders who have been through the same thing, where they would pull up on a scene and there's a severed head, and they were just...
And you're just... Because that's... How else are we supposed to cope, But for me, it was scary. Because really, inmates were like, Dr. Haji, I'm suicidal. And I was like, I'm eating lunch. Like, I really don't care. Granted, I only acted that way when I knew they were not accurately suicidal. But I didn't want to get to the place where I became dismissive just in case. Like, oh my gosh, I'm really becoming desensitized.
Yeah, so I think this is a good PSA to just say, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, if you're a corrections officer, if you're a psychologist,
EMT, all of
if
that.
you're an EMT, if you are in the service industry of helping humans and you're constantly exposed to trauma, you should definitely be aware of what you're exposed to. Pay attention to the signs and symptoms, nightmares, dissociating, anger, isolation, hypervigilance,
moodiness, anger.
So pay attention to those symptoms and what you're experiencing.
Numbness.
You might need some help, and it's okay to seek help, right?
Yeah.
I don't think, and I meant to go back to the PICU and talk to people about that, and I think I will.
Yeah, you should absolutely.
Would you say that creates a certain type of bond between people of certain fields? Like in the prison system, did you feel like the other therapists and psychologists and COs, was there a certain type of bond that you guys saw?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Outside the prison?
My two best friends, one is a forensic social worker here in Florida, and my other best friend is a clinical director at Rikers. And so that's not coincidence. I mean, of course you meet friends at work, but it's kind of like what we talked about, that humor, the jokes, rape jokes, murder jokes. You can't have those jokes with that dark humor with everyone, because they'll just look at you like, oh, please seek help. Like, what's wrong with this?
Yeah, if you put a group of nurses, if you put a group of nurses next to a group of attorneys and you guys all go out to a bar, the nurses are wild, their jokes are dark.
Yeah.
They're talking about sex and body parts and blood and the patient that they had and pus, and the attorneys are like,
what's wrong with these people?
These people are insane.
But yeah, it does create a bond, because it's like, we're in this together. And, just like any other kind of tragedy, humans tend to come together in times of need. I was in New York for 9/11, and you never saw it. New Yorkers go at each other and hate each other, and we curse at each other all day long. But as soon as 9/11 happened, it was like, let me help you, and it's the same kind of feel in a prison. Like, we're in this together. We don't know if we're leaving. You could get, I'm not saying it's, fully dangerous all the time, and 90% of the time you talk to inmates with respect, they'll talk to you with respect. But that element is always there. So for sure it creates a bond, yeah.
What are your thoughts on, there's a show called Beyond Scared Straight.
I love Beyond Scared Straight.
What are your thoughts? Do you think it's effective?
No, I think it's effective short term, but then once that fear is gone, people forget.
What's the show?
Beyond Scared Straight. So, they take like juvies into the prison, and the inmates are like, you want to fucking end up like me? And they like scream at them, you know what I mean? And they're like, you'll become my bitch. And it's just like terrifying. It's Scared Straight, scaring them into not wanting to become a criminal and in prison. I think it's effective short term, but I think once that juvenile goes back home, back to their peers, back to their vaping and their cutting, back to their social media, that experience, they forget it pretty quickly. And that's what most of the research shows, that it has to be a continuous intervention. Not that they should bring them to the prison and scare them every week for a year, but although that might work. But, after the Beyond Scared Straight, and when they're motivated and they realize, damn, I really don't want to end up like that, then we have to continue with therapy, interventions, education, things like that. But that alone, it's probably not effective. No. What do you think? Scared straight.
No, I think it's
No.
like the first thing that I thought of was a DARE commercial, the drug awareness resistance. And it was always
don't do drugs.
the frying egg. You're gonna end
Yeah,
up
yeah,
like this.
yeah.
Then a kid tries smoking weed, and he's like, I actually feel
Yeah,
pretty good.
yeah. Or like you see those horrible commercials about like don't smoke cigarettes. And you're like, God, that's messed up. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And then that's messed up. But if you're a smoker, you're going to be like, that's effed up. I'm not going to smoke. But then 10 minutes later, that commercial is gone.
It's
You're
gone.
lighting up. You have an addiction. You have to address the underlying issues. So I think it's
the nicotine makes you feel good. You
Yeah.
relax. You feel
yeah,
good.
it's an addiction.
You're in a social setting.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm
commercial
going to
is
get
no
hate
longer
mail
you.
from people who have like voice.
Welcome to the club.
It's fine.
Well, I think we'll end it here. I want to thank you
That
so
was
much
awesome.
for your time.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to You have Misdiagnosis Mondays, and you
And I
have
have a, what's it called? A trendy term Thursday.
Trendy Term
Yeah.
Thursdays. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
people
last
are like,
time.
I'm so toxic. I'm like, what does that mean? I got to.
Yeah, this is not a medical term. But awesome. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you so
Haji,
much. Thank you, Dr. Mesa. Thank you, guys.
So I appreciate it. You can find her once again at Rise Psychological Services. That is her private practice as well as her handle. So just Google it.
Yeah.
She should pop up. And if not, it's Dr. Lina Haji. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.